This is El Aborto, The Miscarriage, by Frida Kahlo from 1932, the only finished one she ever produced. It addresses her miscarriage in Detroit the same year, rendering anatomically detailed imagery. Kahlo's nude figure is at the center, surrounded by a fetus, a moon, and an orchid-like plant evoking fertility. The ground is split between orderly vegetation and barren terrain, a metaphor of life and death, while her body is split into light and dark halves, implying psychological fracture. What at first appears purely medical turns into a record of grief and survival, a moment in Kahlo's life when art became a substitute for lost motherhood. The lithograph can be analyzed through four lenses: medical, psychological, gendered, and contextual. From a medical perspective, El Aborto foregrounds Kahlo's body in clinical detail. Her nakedness is emphasized by the addition of jewelry, underscoring the tension between vulnerability experienced in the hospital and the identity she fought to preserve. Some emphasize her grief for infertility. "My biggest regret was always not being able to be a mother," she confessed in a 1930 letter to her mother. Others highlight her ambivalence, noting her claim that "my ambition is to have a child by Diego Rivera," while also recognizing her practical judgment that abortion was the most reasonable cause of action. For Kahlo, miscarriage seemed an inevitable outcome of earlier disabilities: polio as a child and severe pelvic and vaginal injuries from teenage trolley accidents. In this light, the lithograph's left, medical side, is not an expression of longing, but a gesture of disillusionment, a way of managing trauma by presenting the loss as natural and inevitable, and thereby shielding for indifference. The right side of El Aborto, on contrast, externalizes Kahlo's inner world. Her darkened half weeps from both eyes, grief spilling into the clinical detail of the left, binding the physical and emotional pain together. Above, a weeping moon hovers, a recurring symbol at Kahlo's art tied to fertility and loss, underscoring motherhood as mourned. She sees painting as an antidote to maternal failure. For her, making art must take place of making children. Beneath, blood drips from her uterus, fertilizing the dry soil. From the burrow, roots of growing plants emerge, a symbolic transformation of pain into growth and life. And above them, contrasting, sinuous tendrils curl, resembling sperm, pointing not to life in being, but to the failed seed that never became human life. Kahlo thus stages psychological fracture not as weaknesses, but as a creation. She conveys trauma, tears, and absence, but she also delineates a visual metaphor where survival and loss turn into creation, fueled by mourning. El Aborto does more than document trauma. It interrogates how motherhood and the female body are socially coded. Surrounding the nude form with fertility symbols, Kahlo evokes the maternal iconography culturally assigned to women. Yet, she distorts these symbols so they do not affirm but alienate the material ideal. She unsettles the imposed identity. Her stance is both desiring, matching the expectations, but also rejecting, destabilizing the norm that the woman must become a mother to be fulfilled. In her domestic relationship with Rivera, her reproductive suffering carries an internal struggle. Rivera's expectations compelled Kahlo to weigh her own body's limits against masculine demands of progeny, hence she signs the lithograph not as Kahlo, but as Frida Rivera. Even the title, El Aborto, remains ambiguous. While abortion was illegal and largely forbidden socially in the United States, the choice is not medically correct, as she miscarried. It aimed to evoke the tension between the medical necessity of abortion she underwent earlier in her life and the taboo of miscarriage she was struggling with at the moment. In Mexican culture, Kahlo's homeland, motherhood is especially elevated as a woman's ultimate role, transforming her fertility symbols into broken cords, blood, aborted seeds, and miscarriage into empowerment to create art in a landscape of medical, marital, and cultural constraints. Kahlo consequently refuses the comfort of normative femininity and reclaims her agency instead. Although El Aborto is not formally part of the series, it's often paired with Henry Ford Hospital, one of Kahlo's most literal descriptions of reproductive suffering. In the painting, Kahlo lies bleeding on a hospital bed, tethered but red, vein-like ribbons to symbolic objects: fetus, orchid, pelvis, machinery, and a snail. They float around her against Detroit's industrial skyline, the composition making visible the external drama of miscarriage exposed against modernity. In El Aborto, however, Kahlo internalizes the trauma. No overt hospital setting, but a schematic field of symbols, scientific portrayals, and personal metaphors. The shift from a deeply personal schematic El Aborto to the dramatic scene of Henry Ford, painted only months later, signals an evolution Kahlo underwent and already anticipated in the lithograph. Art itself becomes the terrain where bodily grief is transposed into a constructed narrative. Art is no longer a private refuge, but a domain of alienation, exposure, and a careful visual record that transforms the interior struggle of miscarriage into a curated description of experiences aimed for the public gaze. El Aborto was never meant for a museum. Unlike Henry Ford Hospital, it was not staged, nor was it, one can assume, a preparatory study. It was a private, deliberate therapy where suffering became testimony and resolved into comfort. For decades, the work remained with Kahlo's family until it was sold last year to Sotheby's, to the Museum of Latin American Art in Buenos Aires, alongside the letters she wrote to her mother from the hospital. As such, the lithograph, assumed to be made still in the medical facility after the miscarriage, was first and foremost a statement Kahlo made to herself of exposing the pain while fighting it with art, collapsing social, marital, personal, and genderless expectations into an empowering act of self-preservation. Kahlo does not hide the trauma the lack of longed-for offspring brought. Instead, she embraces the reality and transmutes grief into fuel for artistic gain, turning the taboo experience into a public display of emotion, reshaping her own definition of maternity, with her child being art.